Hello friends, welcome to yet another episode of Let's Get Lit. Today we'll be kicking off a new series titled A Beginner's Guide to Cultural Studies. This will be a three-part series aimed at teaching a beginner the fundamentals of cultural studies. So without much ado, let's get lit. Any discussion or any talk on cultural studies must begin with the definition of the term, and as with many other fields, it's very difficult to provide such easy, simplistic definitions that would, in fact, run the risk of being too narrow so as to miss many things, or the risk of being too wide, ending up very unclear and vague. Cultural studies makes this issue of the lack of a simple definition difficult, even more in the sense that it lacks what one would call a definite methodology or a unified theory with regard to, say, other fields, especially traditional theories, or would have what we call a more structured or authorized way of looking at theory. But culture studies is too vast and varied to be anything of that sort. So culture studies basically employs what we call a need-based approach in its studies. And this means that whatever it is that you study will require a methodology or an approach that is tailor-fit for the particular case. And of course, as you all know, and perhaps this is perhaps the most famous aspect of cultural studies, that is, nothing falls short of its reach of study. Even then, we see that this is cultural studies is the in thing right now, the thing to do. And therefore, the tremendous response that this webinar warranted was or received was not very surprising, in the sense that cultural studies is something that people want to learn, that people want to be engaged with. So yeah, continuing with the idea of a definition, of providing a definition to the field, one can simply say that cultural studies is what we call the study of culture. However, as I said before, this definition is too simplistic, and it is problematic in the sense that it fails to identify the foundational aspects of the field. This is something that you would say to a layman. But I thought I will begin from here, the simplistic definition, and that I will ask certain questions regarding this statement, that it is the study of culture. The questions that I would like to discuss are regarding the nature of culture, what it is, and what does it mean to say that the field studies culture. What does the study entail? These are two questions that that will be discussed in the coming slides. If you look at these images, I would like to ask you which of these would represent culture for you, as an individual, as a person who's located in the specificities of his geography, his culture, his or her politics, or their politics. What or which of these images do you think represents culture? And the first two, you can see that there are dance forms that are being represented. The traditional, or what we call classical dance forms of India. In the third picture, the top right corner, you see a picture of what the Guardian calls a ballet, or musical theatre, in the sense, in the British sense of the term. So whether you would incorporate this to your understanding of culture, whether your understanding of culture is limited to what we traditionally or conventionally call the Indian culture, or the idea of the culture in India would be a question that I would like to raise. Then at the and the bottom level, I think we can see that these are some representations that are maybe popular among the urban masses, or even the 90s kids, if there are any here. We have Shaktiman here. I don't know how many of you would consider Shaktiman or Dapangut, if you're familiar with the folk art form. And also, this is some of the cockfighting that we see in rural parts of India. How many of you think that these images represent culture to you, or how many of these images represent cultural degeneration to you is where I would like to begin this question of what culture is. Now, culture can be broadly understood in two senses. Culture in the traditional sense, or high culture. It is seen as a representation of what is best in the human society, intellectually and artistically. This is why we have terms such as in Indian languages, especially we have the term sanskara, which stands for culture, which is the linguistic equivalent for the English word culture. Sanskara, that which is purified, denotes the idea that culture, or what is being considered culture, has to be something that is refined, that is purified, that represents the best of what a human being or a human society can aspire to have. Similarly, in English, we have the term culture, that which is cultivated, that which is grown from nothing. In the sense, the word has similar roots, such as that of the word agriculture. So you get the idea. And traditional English critics, say people like Dr. Johnson or Matthew Arnold, will come to F.R. Lewis in a while. So these people understand and consider culture to be this culture, that which has stood the test of time. So there is a great tradition, culture that is handed over generations, something that has been refined for ages. Matthew Arnold, for example, defines culture as a pursuit of our total perfection, to make the best of what has been thought and known in the world, to make all men live in an atmosphere of sweetness and light. So the sort of, you might sense this idea of there being an eliteness, what we consider high culture, being embedded in all of these ideas. It is where people such as F.R. Lewis talks about, or even Matthew Arnold and F.R. Lewis talk about a small educated minority who are capable of providing an unprompted first-hand judgment, especially with regard to cultural productions such as art or literature. It is the duty of this enlightened minority to uphold and keep alive these traditions. And thus we have a celebration of writers such as Dante, Shakespeare, and a lot who are considered to be the canon, the best in literature. So these are people whom we can call the high culture gladiators. What they do is that they differentiate between the high or minority culture and the ordinary people and their cultures. So one is highly curated, one is perfectionist, and the other is ordinary, everyday things. The further definition, the distinction of the culture of the ordinary people as positive and negative, I will not get into. We'll continue on. And there is always this distinction that they promote between the cultured minority and the masses. Cultured minority are those minds that make use of high arts and literature to enable them to have a sort of ability to discriminate between good and bad in terms of culture. They are able to keep themselves or provide training to counterbalance the worst effects of industrial cultural machine. This is an idea that is related strictly to Arnoldian Leavisite understanding of culture. Earlier critics, what the generalized understanding of high culture, as we talked about, culminates in this idea of how there is a sense of industrialization, sense that industrialization is destroying what was organic or what was the common folk culture instead of and thereby create an urban mass industrial society. Because they think that this is something that they can understand, because they consider the masses, the people, to be passive or uncritical in their ways of or senses or tastes. They can only consume whatever it is given to them. So they are lost to cheap sentiments such as popular novels, press, television, film, etc. We have and the irony is that Shakespeare, someone who was enjoyed by the masses during the Elizabethan age, had by the time of Arnold and Lewis had become what you would consider high culture. We'll sort of slightly move on and discuss what we understand, or cultural studies understands culture to be. In culture studies, or in perhaps a contemporary understanding of culture, it is nothing but a representation of what the people do. It is a particular way of life, whether of a people, a period, or a group, as Raymond Williams says. Raymond Williams famously called culture as something that is ordinary, that is everyday. This definition, however, is inclusive in the sense that it tends to incorporate the popular culture and the working class culture into the purview of what is considered to be culture, as opposed to the traditional understanding of culture as only those things that people, the elite people, would engage with. So that sort of elitist understanding is being overthrown by people such as Raymond Williams or Richard Hoggett. For example, these two texts, which Stuart Hall considers to be the foundational moment of cultural studies, are in turn study of the ordinary lives. Doesn't mean that they exclude high culture or what is considered high culture. It's just that they expand the definition to include other aspects. However, broadly speaking, cultural studies does not, however, see culture as an organic, uncontested expression. As we will discuss later, it's not an autonomous sphere. It contains a lot of contestations. It's an idea that we will talk about in our later slides. And yeah, these two books, which we will come back to, are central to the history of cultural studies, in the sense that critics like Stuart Hall considered them to be the foundational moments of moment of cultural studies. The publication of these two works, Uses of Literacy and Culture and Society, in 1957 and 1958 respectively. As you can see, Richard Hoggett's text was a study on the working class, British working class culture. So you might have already guessed, culture studies has its beginnings in British Marxists. Their idea of having to work with the people, the normal people, has roots in the political theory of cultural studies. That is another thing that we have to talk about. The cultural studies as a field is highly political. It can not be separated. The academic discipline cannot be separated from what we consider as the politics of everyday. In fact, that is the primary concern of cultural studies. Now, culture, therefore, will have to be understood as a set of beliefs, practices, and rituals and traditions shared by a group of people with at least one point of common identity, be it ethnicity, race, language, nationality. This we see in the Indian context. We are, as Shashi Tharoor famously says in his in several of his essays, we can be many things. We can have a culture of our own. We can have subcultures, and we can have national cultures. We can be linked by our nationality, and at the same time be differentiated, divided by our linguistic cultures. In other parts of the world, it's ethnicity or race that differentiates the people. And in that sense, culture has to be understood as the whole way of life. Culture doesn't have to be, when I say ethnicity, race, language, and nationality, it will not end there. For example, the youth can be separated from the rest and be called youth culture. There can be subdivisions within youth culture in terms of gender, race, or any of these issues. So what we have to understand basically is that culture in cultural studies refers to the whole experience of living, the whole way of life, including all forms of living. This idea of there being an elite sense to the word culture is what Raymond Williams opposed in his book Culture and Society. There is an increasing tendency or use of the concept of culture against democracy, socialism, and the working class, or the popular education. So this is a sort of class divide that he's talking about, where whatever the upper class does is high culture and therefore culture, and whatever the rest of the people do is not good enough to be considered culture. So yeah, here in this sense, culture is a highly contested field. Culture in the traditional sense is a very homogeneous, very uncontested, accepted, normalized system. But however, culture as an all-encompassing term is a set of contested and conflictual set of practices, especially with regard to representation and the formation and reformation of social groups. Now we come to the what we call the most popular aspect of cultural studies. When we talk about culture, we of course must talk about popular culture. Culture studies is often misunderstood, or whether some might say rightly understood, to be the field that studies popular culture. While it is not wholly true, popular culture remains to be an important part of cultural studies. Now, what do we normally understand popular culture as? We tend to speak of it in terms of that culture which is liked by, say, many people, most number of people, or that the culture that in India, I think the term that we use is classical. So this is a sort of or set of ideas that did not make it into what we consider classical or high culture. So, and the criterion for exclusion for these practices or representations in the Indian context could be caste, or on a worldwide sense, it could be class. In India in particular, the idea of high culture as equivalent to culture has been there since the inception of the nation, in an attempt to create an unbroken chain of seamless traditions and values and histories. We tend to adopt what we consider high culture, or the culture that was of the elites, to be the culture of the masses. So this is an idea that we can get to at a later stage. I just wanted to put it across. Now, thirdly, popular culture is understood as mass culture, culture that which is produced by the market, politics, capitalism for mass consumption. This is more what you would call the Frankfurt School's way of looking at popular culture. And then fourthly and finally, culture that emanates from the people, from the grassroots, rather than something that is imposed The third sense of the term, popular culture, um, connotes that there is an imposition of culture from someplace else. However, this fourth sense would like to see culture as that emanates from the people, the commoners. However, I think and I feel that definition for popular culture lies in between some of these definitions. It involves the people, yes, it emanates from the people. Of course, there is an influence of the capitalist market upon and the need to produce mass consumption involved in the production of mass culture. Yes, popular culture is widely favored and liked by people. There is a sense of exclusion from the high culture in what constitutes culture or popular culture. So popular culture can be seen as a site of struggle between the resistance of subordinate groups in society and the forces of incorporation operating in the interest of dominant groups in society. This is something that I was just mentioning with regard to India. So often what happens is that a dominant culture is imposed upon the people by the interest of the dominant groups in a particular society. This happens all over the world, and popular culture is a site which contests this imposition by resisting and producing alternate possibilities of cultures and cultural representations. Popular culture is a field of resistance. So that is why popular culture becomes so fanciful. That's why it becomes so popular in terms of studies in cultural studies. So again, it also involves the negotiation between the culture imposed by the market. Yes, of course, there are elements that are imposed upon the people by the market and the cultures of the people. And this is also another resistance that works there. Whether there are cultures that are untouched by other factors, including the market, is a highly contestable idea. I will not, let's not go there. Maybe we need a series of lectures if we are to look at each and every word of this idea and to present it as such to you. We'll move on. I have incorporated a meme here. This is something that people normally say about cultural studies. It is a highly intellectual field but it does thesis on comic books. This idea. This is a joke. Of course, this is a joke, but there is politics that underlies this joke. That people understand the popular productions, children's books or comics, graphic novels, to be irrelevant to the society at large. So we will discuss that in the later slides, this idea, but let that be there. So the word popular in popular culture, of course, refers to the general populace. What the people, what they do is what popular culture is concerned with. However, as I said, you must understand popular culture or the mass society as heterogeneous. There is no indication that this group is homogeneous. There are vast what do you call differences between what constitute or the groups that constitute popular culture or that is involved in the production of popular culture. However, these groups are contrastable. They can be put together and contrasted against the politically or socially dominant groups within the society, and that's why we tend to talk about popular culture versus high culture. That sort of a debate occurs. As we said, popular culture is a space where power struggles with regard to the control, the hegemony and representation are issues that we will discuss in a bit. So hegemonic control over the society and the representations. This is a constant struggle that happens. There will be a dominant culture, there will be a counter culture, what you would call counter culture, if in terms of what we would call similar to what Hegel or Marx talks about in the idea of dialectics. Now, popular culture, as culture studies sees it, concerns with two aspects: cultural practices, your everyday life, what you do. And then there are signifying practices or cultural texts or cultural productions. This is where the interesting aspects or what makes culture studies popular, I suppose, comes in. It involves cinema, it involves comics, it involves even classical dance. Culture studies does not leave out what is considered to be elite or high class, high culture. So all of these things, these signifying cultures, or whether classical dance would come under what you would consider popular culture is a whole different issue. But yes, there are studies that take place in the field. Now, I would like to show you all a video.
जब साथ हो 7up, I feel up.
This is basically an ad for 7up, the famous soft drink that we all drink. In this ad, we see the incorporation of Kathakali Vesham with a varied set of art forms, both indigenous and Western, something that we tend to call at least in some of the parts of India, cinematic with regard to the dance or the music that you hear. In fact, the music that you hear in the beginning is Dapanguta. I'll share this link for this song later. So the music played in the beginning was that of Dapanguta. The location was the streets. The dance involved was an amalgam of various dance styles from across the world, which includes, of course, Dapanguta. What happened with this ad is that it became so controversial that Kalamandalam, perhaps the apex organization or university now in Kerala that promotes traditional or classical arts, slapped a legal notice on PepsiCo. PepsiCo owns this soft drink. And you can see this is a collection of snippets of how people responded to this ad in particular. The people found it highly offensive. Some people said that you shouldn't kill my traditional art. If you can see the comments that I have taken there. And Kalamandalam, in fact, asked for the setting up of an ethics committee along with the lines of the film censor board to scrutinize the portrayal of traditional art in films and advertisements. They found this to be demeaning, to be insulting to the practice of Kathakali. Kathakali, again, high culture, which according to one commenter, one person is not a dance you can learn in a month or two. It requires dedicated practice. This is extreme nonsense. You cannot perform Dapanguta in Kathakali costumes. So this is where the distinction between Kathakali, which is the high culture, and Dapanguta, which represents perhaps the popular culture of the art form of the people. This distinction is clearly mentioned. According to the so-called promoters of culture, Dapanguta can be done by anyone. It doesn't require any class, let's say. However, Kathakali, on the other hand, it has a hierarchy, a strict class hierarchy, and a learning curve which a commoner, a normal, popular, cinematic dancer cannot fathom or adapt. And ironically, Kathakali is perhaps Kerala's best-selling commodity when it comes to tourism. Nobody has a problem with any of that, in the sense that the older practices that on how and when Kathakali could be performed, or who should put this costume on and how it should be performed, all these things have taken a side seat when it comes to tourism, as it brings in a lot of money to the state. Then it is fine, but when it is done by a popular dancer as a part of a soft drink commercial, it becomes problematic. So, and this is the image that you see in the middle is classic cartoon from R.K. Lakshman, where he pokes fun at Kathakali for scaring a foreigner. This is the kind of distinction that I wanted to bring across. This is the kind of stuff that cultural studies is concerned with. How Kathakali is put on a high pedestal and how other forms of art are not. How certain rituals, certain practices, certain art is privileged over others. What is the politics behind that? There is definitely a politics of caste. There is definitely a politics of what is normally considered to be the hegemonic culture.